еще и выживать надо было. Не болею, чувствую. Ну и не надо это все. Потому что это все зло. Держись за все. Не надо. Почувствовал реакцию наконец. В своих штанах, да. И уважение к женскому. Нежность исходящая. Ой, какая-то. Нам-то бохер уже детей не носит. Ну ладно, ну значит это приятно, если детей носить. Что надо такое? Бояться надо? Нет, не надо. Да. Вот поэтому вам нельзя верить, пока не подпишет. Но сейчас уже это не актуально. Да, значит, партнерские основания. Да при любых основаниях. Делаешь кое-то правильно. Ну, потом надо убедить просто. Она все-таки женщина, у нее все равно организм женский, поэтому там где-то, скажем так, женское сердце где-то внутри. Ты делаешь коитус, она такая, давайте будем планировать. Она такая, нет, давайте это самое. Здесь сделаем аборт, здесь сделаем матку, это самое, здесь пылесосим матку, здесь еще что-нибудь. Здесь ты такой, ну, это дорогая, это самое, там, ты как женщина, рано или поздно надо что-то живое в ней проснется, потому что ну это наш такой вариант, после европейский, это их главная функция. Все остальное туда не лезь. Это их организм, это их дело, это их святыня. И туда должен сперму как опускать свою, и все, и там, да. Это есть мое имя любви, оно так и есть, да. И лучше ничего этого не придумаешь. И не надо ноги гулять. Лучше данного сердечного ритма, как бы, а давай лучше сделаем так, чтобы у нас клетки лучше делились, более интенсивно, нет, чтобы они больше, чтобы они... Вот я говорю, с этим не шутят, с природой, со здоровьем. Тем более любви, я такой, что любви, романтизм, так выходит, нет, ошибся опять. Надо партнерские условия взаимодействия. И ты успел реализоваться, я не получил. И тогда жизнь у тебя точно нормально. И дети хорошие, главное. Хорошая. Всем должно быть хорошо, понимаешь? Ну не знаю, насколько это к слову буквально. Буквально так. Ну буквально. Женское, оно как бы все бесплатно. Как вот здоровье, ты родился, оно тебя бесплатно выдано сразу, понимаешь? Ну бывают такие, которые... Да, кстати, да. Все женское так устроено, понимаешь? Деньги засылать начнешь, только хуже, значит, это все будет уже минус. Да. Наверное, как ты женился, есть такая гипотеза, но она немножко печальная. Да, что все женщины, они все, у них всех женское сердце или как угодно, все они женщины, что женщина именно всегда женщина. Просто у них разные характеры, а поскольку им характер вообще не нужен, то есть это все просто оттаивание, скажем так. То есть поэтому, если ты женился, если это особь женского пола, то все нормально. Начинаешь адекватно, даже если как бы там, понимаешь, какие-то по пьяни еще что-нибудь там. Все нормально, все женщины, они женщины с ним, да, вообще просто такой, мило просто, да, вообще. Не столько шутка, так, что ли, да? Да. Ну, то есть, тем более та, которая, ну, типа того, да. Тем более, любое дело стерпится, слюбится, бла-бла, любое дело наживное, бла-бла-бла. Счастье в доме, да, и так далее. Постепенно как-то, да, что таяло. Инициировали. А мне его не ну, я не знаю. Это как-то в наших организмах спрятано, понимаешь? То ли там гормоны, то ли еще что-то такое. Да. Мозговые какие-нибудь. Всего лишь так, да. Ну, конечно, точно. Какая-то вот тайна любви, рождения самой, вот, как вот белок свернулся когда-то. Когда это произошло, как вообще непонятно, правильно? Как там, с чего, откуда ниточка идет? Любви, да, жизнь, да. Где-то отклик у нас есть. Ну да, ну, да, наверное. Ну, не что-то вот такое, да. Женщины к этому намного ближе, наверное, так думаю. Да. Ну, по-своему. Да, так наоборот. Ну да, ну да. Я ничего не отдал. Ну, подышать чуть-чуть. Он понимает, вот это, да. Все равно то же самое получится. И... Что за... Вот и все, спрятаться, невидимка. Женщины, женская тема невидимой и интимность, понимаешь, и это хорошо. Не для них, конечно! И так всю жизнь прожили, представляешь? И это хорошо. Я тоже это не понимаю, потому что для меня женщина и мужчина это одно и то же. То есть, если как это так? Я только что одна, что ли, буду? Да, надо сначала себя выдать. То есть, чтобы это самое, чтобы кого-то обеспечивать. На кого-то работаешь, что ли? Ну, наверное, есть лучший вариант, чем свою жизнь вести, чем на ленивого внука работать. Хороший место. Ну, вообще мужчинка вообще маленький Меня это тоже всегда радовало, потому что у меня отдельная была семья и мужчины. Я когда это наблюдал, я не успел пробиться. У меня то есть я имею в виду, что все-таки это будет другой в твоей жизни, то есть как минимум даже если мужик не закрепился за тобой, как за позитроном, так сказать, и как свободный электрон двинулся дальше в путь, скажем так, то все равно у тебя какой-то животики наследие осталось, какой-то приятный случай, романтизма, так скажем, то есть тебе уже никак не помогут. Учитывая, что если ты нормально меняемый человеческий объект, мужского пола, то есть... теперь это вообще наоборот уже, я понял. То есть, как бы, я не знаю, теперь, учитывая, я не знаю даже, что сказать вам, то есть, как бы, да, да, тебе надо пол менять. Сейчас такие случаи просто зарабатывать на этом. Ну, это всего лишь тело, подумаешь, тело, жизнь же еще, карьера есть, душа еще есть. Вчера искусство для души, скишь, не занимайся еще, да. Ой, на славу, ой, что ну, что-нибудь такое там, интимная женская. Как советский, но. Тогда зачем он тогда женщинами-то родится? Сразу же делает эти операции мужскую, сразу мускулатуру мужскую, боржовые что-нибудь вставлять здесь. Ну что вы так не видите? Как вы прожить? Как минимум этого должно быть побольше, наверное. Ну ладно, я шучу. Все надо рассказать. Никто не знает. Ну, по логике вроде как так. Ну, не так. Не знаю, плохо это или хорошо, если не увязать всю жизнь, да.
Logical, it's there. It's important, but that is not what I'm putting into like the arguments and the theory of explanation. So but that psychological, it's there. It's a motive. It's ongoing. But on the other hand, for me, and I guess this is again why I have a feeling of loyalty. It's like right to what I saw in Plato and in Socrates and the whole Neoplatonic tradition. I mean, the late, yeah. So I have a loyalty to all of these people, and you know, the Neoplatonic tradition is the closest label I would sort of put on myself. Now, why does that connect it? Because at the forefront, and I mean, I've been deeply influenced by Pearl and other people on this, D.C. Schindler, who is a Christian, by the way. But the idea that at the forefront of is this idea that the machinery of intelligibility and the processes of being are like you can't separate them. That intelligibility is the thing that gives us access to being.
Right. So that was almost ontology, epistemology, but you're using another language for it, or is it more than that?
It's more than that because I think of intelligibility as not just, well, we can talk about this later about the 4 kinds of knowing. And this goes to the,
Well, let's go, we can even go there now, because you know, because you're a cognitive scientist, what's interesting is, when you mobilize your arguments, you have to rely on nomenclature and concepts and evidence bases. And those who know your work well, I mean, quite often come to 4E cognition
yes,
and sort of 4P epistemology,
Yeah.
broadly speaking. Maybe take a moment now just to explain those things, because I want from there to get into what we mean by transjective, and then maybe come back to what you just said about the intertwining of something more than ontology and epistemology, something more than objective subjective, and see how those two worlds.
that's a great way to go. Let's do that. That's
So,
excellent.
but
Thank you,
first,
John.
for those watching, what do we mean by these terms?
So 4E, and I actually think it should be 6E, but 4E has become very the way of teaching. So I had, again, the great good fortune that one of my colleagues at the University of Toronto, and somebody like who I would consider even a friend, was Evan Thompson. And Evan Thompson is one of the, Evan Thompson is
Connected cognition.
he is one of, I think, him and Varela, to my mind, are the founding figures of 4D cognitive science. There's a lot of other important people, like Gallagher is important, and of course there's prefigures in people like Merleau-Ponty. But the basic idea is, well, spelling out these. First is the idea that cognition is inherently embodied. So instead of thinking of the body as just sort of Cartesian clay that is a vehicle that is molded and moved by the mind, right? What you do is you actually realize that the biology of the body is actually constitutive of cognition. And so my particular work, relevance realization, says, right, this very important function of being able to zero in on relevant information relies on me being a biological being, right? And so that's like, if I don't have the bioeconomy of my body, I would be like a computer. And when a computer faces information, it doesn't care about one piece of information over another.
AI struggles with this.
Exactly. Well, struggling with a lot, right? That's the relevance problem, right? And so this is the idea that cognition is inherently embodied. And then and going with that is the idea that it's inherently embedded. This is the idea that cognition isn't in my head. It's so again, it's like biology. Is an organism adaptive? Well, the adaptivity isn't in the organism. It's between the organism and the environment. The same thing with cognition. It's inactive. This is Evan's main idea. That what we're looking at aren't so much, propositional processing in a computer. What you're looking at is a dynamical system that is constantly modifying the sensory motor loop. So the mind is much more enacted than what we sort of argued in your head. And then the last one is extended, which is the idea that what we're doing right now, you and I together are making this conversation together, and the conversation starts to take on a life of its own, and it's solving problems that you and I can't solve individually. So cognition is extended through other people and through the environment.
That would also apply to your phone or your calculator or your pencil as well.
Yes, yes.
Right. Then, so we're 4E's then. So in cognition is embodied, embedded, enacted, and extended. Yeah.
And I think there should be 2 more.
Curious, tell me more, yeah.
So I think one of the things that's become really essential is that we should think of cognition as emotional, because what we've done is tended to separate cognition and emotion into these. Right. So,
that's what I meant by cognitive science, by the way, as well.
Yeah, exactly. And so this is to see that in emotion, right? Affect broadly. Is broad. It is deeply. Again, back to relevance realization. I have to care about this information and not care about that information. And then exactly.
In political psychology, the emotional aspect of cognition is particularly important.
Oh well, and for all of it, I think also for the sapiential, right, having to do with wisdom, because I mean Socrates was much more of what do you care about? What do you, not so much just your arguments, but because often the arguments don't come to any conclusion in the dialogue.
What's the stake here?
Yeah, what you care, and he's trying to reorient people to what they care about. The last one is exaptive. This comes from the work of Michael Anderson and the idea that cognition is the computer metaphors are used. Like you have circuits that either evolved or learned for doing one function, and then you co-opt them and repurpose them for doing other things.
So I played chess professionally for many years, and although I don't use it Like I don't think of the chessboard when I'm living. I have no doubt that I've exacted something or other.
I think there's some preliminary evidence to support that. So that's sort of the standard 4E, and then, like I say, most people in practice are 5E or 6E.
Okay, great. And then the 4 Ps, just to get the full nomenclature correct.
So that's me trying to do a synoptic integration of all of the 4E cognitive science and trying to get it in.
I think the representative of the Secretariat.
Российская Федерация приняла решение о досрочном прекращении 7 апреля 2022 года своих полномочий члена Совета ООН по правам человека. Россия всегда рассматривала Совет ООН по правам человека.
I think the representative of the Secretariat.
The voting has been completed. Please lock the machine.
The result of the vote is as follows. In favor, 93. Against, 24. Abstentions, 58.
Хочу напомнить, месяц назад стояла
到危机的倡议和举措。在此情况下，急于在联大采取行动，逼迫各国选边，急于在联大和举措。在此情况下，急于在联大采取行动，逼迫各国选边站队，将加剧会员国分裂，激化当事方矛盾，火上浇油，不利于冲突的降级，更不利于推进和平谈判。
имеет отношение к субстантивной части нашего выступления. Имеет отношение к субстантивной части нашего выступления. Мы сделали достаточно четкое заявление. Благодарю за внимание.
Россия всегда рассматривала Совет ООН по правам человека в качестве важного компонента универсальной системы поощрения и защиты прав человека, главная роль которого заключается в содействии развитию конструктивного и максимально деполитизированного международного диалога по ключевым вопросам правозащитной повестки дня. К сожалению, в современных условиях Совет фактически монополизирован одной группой государств, использующих его в своих конъюнктурных целях.
This General Assembly voted just a few moments ago to suspend them from the Human Rights Council, and that is now done. But it seemed to us that they were suggesting that they were also withdrawing from the Human Rights Council, which has a different effect.
The rare decision this Assembly has taken today sends a strong signal of accountability and hopefully will help preventing and discouraging more violations of human rights.
What's your reaction to the number of abstentions and
I don't really
votes
care about
against?
the abstentions. I care that the Russian Federation was suspended and was very impatient and almost immediately capitulated by withdrawal. You know, you do not submit your resignation after you are fired. That's exactly what happened to the Russian Federation. Submit your resignation after you are fired. That's exactly what happened to the Russian Federation.
Welcome back. China and Ukraine's foreign minister speaking by phone yesterday. The conversation, a signal that Chinese President Xi Jinping could soon speak with Ukrainian President Zelensky for the first time since Russia's invasion. Joining me right now is the Atlas Organization's founder and the author of China's Vision of Victory, Jonathan D.T. Ward. Jonathan, it's good to see you. Thanks very much for being here. So far, Xi Jinping has supported Russian President Vladimir Putin. There's no way around that. There's no way to suggest otherwise, given the fact that he has called the sanctions outrageous. Your thoughts on what Xi Jinping might want to say to Zelensky?
Well, I think they're playing both sides here. I mean, trying to sort of keep up an appearance of being a good actor, especially for a European audience. I mean, their trade with Europe is very important to their long-term strategy. And at the same time, they're, I'd say, a fervent supporter of Moscow. I mean, we see that in all their ideological communications that, both in their own language and, even publicly. I mean, the meeting between the Russian and Chinese foreign ministers is also one that was sort of in keeping with their no limits partnership declaration. So it's pretty clear whose side Beijing is on, but they believe that they can fool the rest of us. And then they've been very good at that, honestly, for years, into thinking that they're a responsible actor. I mean, that's the game they play, and we're playing it with them for the most part.
So what are your thoughts about what? I'm sorry?
We're just not calling them on that in a significant enough way, and we haven't imposed real consequences yet.
What kind of consequences should be installed at this point? I mean, Zelensky is begging for weapons. I don't know why it's such a slow walk to get these weapons, but we're still waiting to get those MiG jets to Ukraine so that they can have air power and air cover. During the past 41 days of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, China has continued to blame the United States. Beijing also says that NATO should have been dissolved after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Jonathan, what is China going to do here? Is it looking to partner with Russia and then ultimately acquire Russia, overtake Russia in terms of all of its minerals and mining riches?
Well, I think what's really going on here, Maria, is as
числом голосов выйдут во второй тур, который намечен на 24 апреля.
В Шанхае уже третью неделю действуют жесткие карантинные меры. 26 миллионов жителей мегаполиса вынуждены соблюдать режим полной изоляции. За последние сутки здесь выявлено 24 тысячи заразившихся коронавирусом. При этом у большинства из них не проявляется каких-либо симптомов. В воскресенье из местных больниц выписались 11 тысяч выздоровевших пациентов. Главная проблема сейчас связана с обеспечением горожан, которым запрещено выходить из дома, продуктами и предметами первой необходимости. Власти организовали их доставку через специализированные онлайн-платформы. Но в местных соцсетях люди жалуются, что службы не справляются с объемом заказов, и многим приходится непросто. Сообщается, что столь строгий и продолжительный карантин вызывает у жителей Шанхая все большее недовольство.
Акция в поддержку России на Кипре вылилась в противостояние. Местные украинцы вышли на дорогу с флагами своей страны и нарисовали на проезжей части контуры человеческих тел. Напряженность возросла и потребовалось вмешательство полиции. Колонна в поддержку РФ отправилась из Ларнаки и присоединилась к сторонникам, базирующимся в Лимассоле. В своих выступлениях организаторы говорили о лжи западных СМИ относительно того, что происходит на Украине. Имран Хан вынужден покинуть пост премьер.
Вчера я говорю, азовцев всех в шею гнать, просто украинцы сами взяли и азовцев всех там расстреляли и что-нибудь с ними сделали. Чтобы там вообще
Министра Пакистана, он проиграл вотум недоверия в парламенте. Голосование состоялось после нескольких недель политических беспорядков в стране. За ставку премьера, обвиняемого оппозицией в коррупции, проголосовали 174 депутата из 342. Оппозиция отпраздновала победу над главой правительства, бывшим профессиональным игроком в крикет, который всеми силами пытался удержаться у власти, вплоть до инициирования распуска парламента с тем, чтобы провести новые досрочные выборы. Но на прошлой неделе Верховный суд признал все действия Хана незаконными. Парламент смог вновь собраться и проголосовать. Сегодня мы пришли сюда, чтобы отпраздновать победу демократии. Имран Хан давал лживые обещания, пытаясь привлечь на свою сторону общественность. Сегодня настал его последний час. Он сказал, что будет бороться до последнего меча, но сегодня мы его не увидим. Хан настаивает на том, что стал жертвой заговора с участием Соединенных Штатов. Он призвал своих сторонников выйти на улицы. В правительственный район пакистанской столицы, в предшествовавшие заседанию парламента часы, были стянуты сотни полицейских. Имран Хан, муджахед, борец за свободу, говорят, что все кончено. Мы пытаемся морально подготовиться к этому. Мы очень расстроены. Он хотел поднять наш народ с колен. Никто не сможет с ним сравниться. В истории Пакистана ни один премьер-министр не отбывал полный срок мандата главы правительства, но Хан стал первым, кто потерял этот пост посредством вотума недоверия в парламенте. Солнечный свет переливается на бело-розовых лепестках, а тонкие стволы деревьев мирно качаются на весеннем ветру. В Сеуле на берегах канала Полвангчон зацвела вишня. В эти выходные здесь впервые за 3 года пандемии проходит весенний фестиваль, куда пришли десятки жителей южнокорейской столицы. На камнях у воды они гуляют, едят сахарную вату, играют в настольные игры и надеются, что скоро смогут снять защитные маски. Все больше стран освобождаются от масок, и кажется, что количество заражений снижается по всему миру. Несмотря на сравнительно большие цифры заболеваемости в Южной Корее, я надеюсь, что мы снимем маски уже в этом году и вернемся к обычной счастливой жизни. В прошлом месяце в Южной Корее зафиксировали абсолютный рекорд числа заражений COVID-19. Так, 17 марта в лабораториях страны получили 621 317 положительных тестов. При этом в течение всего 2021 года в месяц заболевало не более нескольких сотен людей.
В поворотный момент истории Европы Франция выбирает главу государства. Это выборы исторического значения. Следите за самыми важными выборами этого года на канале YouNow.
Как вот уровень навыков разговора, это становится легко говорить. Так же любых навыков. Наше мышление, даже математика. Даже в ядерном физике. Это уже другой вариант. Ты хочешь сразу увидеть ступень вперед.
Artificial intelligence is one of the big technology
Это надо быть
changes.
уверенным.
Let's find out more.
Ну да, вот я про это говорю. Ну ничего, так и да, ничего
Дубай – это передовой город.
Будет служить человечеству.
Это место, где процветают инновации и новые идеи.
По последнему слову техники.
От исследования космоса до революционных технологий.
Познакомьтесь с последними открытиями науки.
Узнайте, как Дубай стал важным центром изобретений. Сантек на телеканале и веб-сайте Евроньюз. Первый тур президентских выборов проходит во Франции. По данным МВД страны, к 17 часам проголосовали 65% избирателей.
Украинская сторона ожидает крупного наступления российских войск. Мирные жители эвакуируются из зоны предстоящих сражений. Британский премьер Борис Джонсон посетил Киев с неожиданным визитом. Великобритания отправит на Украину новую крупную партию вооружений.
Премьер-министр Пакистана Имран Хан проиграл вотум недоверия в парламенте. Он стал первым главой государства, отстраненным от власти таким образом.
Католики во всем мире отмечают Пальмовое воскресенье. Папа Римский Франциск провел торжественную мессу в Ватикане.
Первый тур выборов президента проходит во Франции. Прогноз социологов о низкой явке сбывается. По данным МВД страны, к 17 часам дня проголосовали 65% избирателей. Это почти на 4,5% пункта меньше, чем на предыдущих выборах в 2017 году. Впрочем, до антирекорда 20-летней давности с явкой чуть более 58% достаточно далеко. Голосовать важно, особенно сегодня со всеми этими проблемами.
Смотри, если, например, такой из Чехии идет поезд с танками, например. Раз, короче, нету поезда, не доехал, лети на Украину, например. Бывает такое иногда, да? Не знаю, что. Ну или Борис Джонсон. Засосало просто.
Сделать это, что оно даст, увидим потом. Даже если вы не определились, идти на выборы надо, даже чтобы оставить пустой бюллетень. Его не учтут, конечно, но это определенный сигнал. Все 12 кандидатов уже исполнили свой гражданский долг и отправились в предвыборные штабы ждать результатов. Их начнут оглашать вечером с закрытием участков. 2 претендента на президентский пост с наибольшим числом голосов выйдут во второй тур, который намечен на 24 апреля.
Колонна российской военной техники длиной 13 километров направилась на юг Донбасса. Так утверждают западные военные аналитики, ссылаясь на спутниковые снимки американской компании «Максар», сделанные в пятницу. Министерство обороны России опубликовало видеокадры, на которых, как утверждается, российские ударные вертолеты К-52 наносят удары по колонне украинской бронетехники и зенитных комплексов. Противник продолжает полномасштабную вооруженную агрессию против нашего государства. Пытается прорвать оборону подразделений вооруженных сил Украины в районе города Изюм и установить полный контроль над Мариуполем. Оккупанты стремятся улучшить тактические позиции дивизии на Николаевском направлении. Предвидя крупные сражения, мирные жители стремятся покинуть Краматорск, к которому приближается линия фронта. После ракетного удара по вокзалу многие боятся садиться на поезд. Люди еще сильнее напуганы, и это одна из проблем. Они больше не решаются ехать железной дорогой и уезжают теперь на машинах. Международный комитет Красного Креста вместе с немецким Красным Крестом пытаются помочь с эвакуацией людей, получивших ранения на передовой. Французское телевидение представило в субботу видеозапись из роддома в Мариуполе, где за время боев за город появилось на свет 26 младенцев, один из которых не выжил. На этажах находиться опасно. Люди прячутся в подвале. Премьер-министр Великобритании Борис Джонсон и президент Украины Владимир Зеленский прошлись по улицам Киева, где Джонсон побывал с неожиданным визитом в субботу. Как заявлялось, целью поездки была демонстрация солидарности с украинским народом. После начала в стране боевых действий Киев посещали уже и другие лидеры стран Европы. По итогам встречи Джонсон и Зеленский провели пресс-конференцию. Эта война определенно вносит ясность относительно будущего Украины. Будущего, где Великобритания вместе с друзьями и партнерами поставляет оборудование, технологии, ноу-хау, разведданные, чтобы Украина больше не подверглась вторжению. Мы должны оказать еще большее давление на Российскую Федерацию. Поддерживая оборону Украины, мы должны оказывать давление в виде санкций.
Від Російської Федерації тиснути санкціями потужно. Я дякую Великій Британії, яка продовжує ці потужні.
Ранее Джонсон объявил, что его страна направит на Украину новую партию современных вооружений, включая зенитные и противотанковые ракеты на сумму в 100 миллионов фунтов стерлингов.
Stand Up for Ukraine. В субботу в Сараеве прошел митинг в поддержку Украины. Мероприятие совпало с 30-летней годовщиной начала осады столицы Боснии и Герцеговины. 5 апреля 1992 года, в начале Боснийской войны, Сараево осадили войска Югославии, а затем Сербии. 30 лет после начала осады города Сараево, самая длинная осада в истории современной цивилизации. Мы думали, что война и агрессия больше никогда не придут в Европу. К сожалению, это не так. Боснийская война долгое время считалась самым кровавым конфликтом в Европе со времен Второй мировой. Но сегодня боснийцы вспоминают ее в контексте нынешней войны на Украине. Многие пришли на площадь с украинскими флагами и желто-голубыми лентами. Временный поверенный в делах посольства Украины в Боснии и Герцеговине Сергей Минилов поблагодарил жителей страны за поддержку. Мероприятие завершилось концертом виолончелистки Белмы Алец.
Акция в поддержку России. На Кипре вылилось противостояние. Местные украинцы вышли на дорогу с флагами своей страны и нарисовали на проезжей части контуры человеческих тел. Напряженность возросла и потребовалось вмешательство полиции. Колонна в поддержку РФ отправилась из Ларнаки и присоединилась к сторонникам, базирующимся в Лимассоле. В своих выступлениях организаторы говорили о лжи западных СМИ относительно того, что происходит на Украине. Болсонару никогда больше, против роста цен на топливо и газ, против безработицы и голода. Под такими лозунгами вышли на демонстрацию протеста жители бразильского Сан-Паулу. Акцию организовали общественные движения и профсоюзы. Они требуют отставки президента Жаира Болсонару, обвиняя его в бездействии перед лицом экономического кризиса, который привел к высокой инфляции, безработице и местами к голоду. Имран Хан вынужден покинуть пост премьер-министра Пакистана. Он проиграл вотум недоверия в парламенте. Голосование состоялось после нескольких недель политических беспорядков в стране. За ставку премьера, обвиняемого оппозицией в коррупции, проголосовали 174 депутата из 342. Оппозиция отпраздновала победу над главой правительства, бывшим профессиональным игроком в крикет, который всеми силами пытался удержаться у власти, вплоть до инициирования распуска парламента с тем, чтобы провести новые досрочные выборы. Но на прошлой неделе Верховный суд признал все действия Хана незаконными. Парламент смог вновь собраться и проголосовать. Сегодня мы пришли сюда, чтобы отпраздновать победу демократии. Имран Хан давал лживые обещания, пытаясь привлечь на свою сторону общественность. Сегодня настал его последний час. Он сказал, что будет бороться до последнего мяча, но сегодня мы его не увидим. Хан настаивает на том, что стал жертвой заговора с участием Соединенных Штатов. Он призвал своих сторонников выйти на улицы. Правительственный район пакистанской столицы, в предшествовавшие заседанию парламента часы, были стянуты сотни полицейских. Имран Хан, муджахед, борец за свободу, говорят, что все кончено. Мы пытаемся морально подготовиться к этому. Мы очень расстроены. Он хотел поднять наш народ с колен. Никто не сможет с ним сравниться. В истории Пакистана ни один премьер-министр не отбывал полный срок мандата главы правительства, но Хан стал первым, кто потерял этот пост посредством вотума недоверия в парламенте.
Папа Римский Франциск отслужил торжественную мессу на площади Святого Петра в Ватикане по случаю Пальмового воскресенья. Это первый важный католический праздник, который отмечается массово после снятия здесь...
We're here in the north, in the city of Chernihiv. This was also a major focal point for the Russian military as it pushed north. Russian forces have now retreated from this area, but as they have pulled back, we have seen laid bare the full horror of what was going on here, the full scale of just the astonishing amount of bombardment that was raining down on this city for more than a month as it was completely encircled and besieged. Take a look.
For weeks, Chernihiv was completely cut off from the rest of the country. Once a vibrant city of 300,000 people, now parts of it a wasteland. Just 45 miles from the Belarusian border, it was quickly surrounded by Russian forces. There was no power, no water, and little food. 71-year-old Ivan Ivanovich survived the relentless bombardment, but his struggles are far from over.
He's saying that he's hungry, he needs something to eat. He's asked us if we have any groceries.
Less than 1 week after Russian forces left this area, Chernihiv is reeling, and the true scale of its loss is only starting to emerge. Outside the morgue, makeshift coffins stand ready for the dead. Authorities say at least 350 civilians were killed in the bombardment, and they expect to find more. Overwhelmed, morgue director Sergei Andreev is now using a refrigerator truck to store the bodies of those who have yet to be identified. Their relatives likely fled the fighting or were killed in it. He tells us hundreds more died because they simply couldn't reach the hospital. There was a constant flow of dead people like this in our morgue. The main reason was heart attacks, pneumonia, diabetes, he says. And I believe all of this was because they didn't get medical treatment on time. Cut off from the main cemetery by constant shelling, the city was forced to clear a wood to make room for the dead. Buried in large trenches, their names signposted for relatives to find.
It's so heartbreaking to see as people here looking desperately, trying to find their loved ones among this mass of new graves.
Did you find him? This woman asks. She is looking for her husband, Vladimir Shulga. I can't find him, her daughter tells us. I need to keep searching. Those who are lucky enough to find their family members can at least say goodbye. A farewell brings little solace. At one grave, relatives mourn the death of Vladimir Adjuchenko, a Ukrainian soldier who was ambushed by Russian forces as he tried to recover the bodies of his fallen comrades. His father, Leonid, says it was 17 days before the Russians left and he could finally reach the place where his son was killed. I dug the ground with my own hands. I uncovered his face, he says, and I recognized him. We waited for him and then we lost him, Vladimir's wife says. They took him and we lost him. Russia's war has taken so many from Chernihiv, and while its forces may have retreated, the grief will not remain.
Now, despite the ferocity and the brutality of Russia's onslaught here in the north, the Ukrainian army was able to stop them from entering the city. They literally got just a mile away from the outskirts in that direction behind me. But what's interesting, John and Brianna, is that when you talk to people here, it doesn't yet feel like victory. There are still a lot of fears for many citizens of
European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen is in Ukraine as part of an EU delegation. The visit is meant to send a strong message of support for Ukraine, including for its EU membership bid. Along with the bloc's foreign policy chief, Josep Borrell, von der Leyen met with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in the Ukrainian capital. And earlier, she had visited a mass grave in Bucha, a town outside Kyiv. Here's a part of what the European Commission President had to say during her trip.
I started my day today with a visit to Bucha because being in Bucha and seeing what has happened, you can tell that our humanity was shattered in Bucha. And it is right and just that the world has voted to suspend Russia from the Human Rights Council. It is a war, yes, that Russia unleashed against an innocent Ukraine, but it's much, much more than that. On top, it is these big questions that will be decided in this war. So your fight is also our fight. And I'm here in Kiev with you today to send a very strong message that the European Union is by your side. We stand by your side. This is the message that, dear Volodymyr, I want to bring to you, but also to the Ukrainian people.
For more, we're joined by DW correspondent Alexandra von Naumann, who joins us from the Ukrainian capital. Alexandra, talk to us about the significance of this visit by top European Union officials to Ukraine.
Well, I think it was very significant to see the president of the Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov has acknowledged that Russia has sustained significant losses of troops in Ukraine. In an interview with Sky News, he called it a huge tragedy for Russia. It's a rare admission by Russian officials of military losses, but Mr. Peskov said that Russia still hopes to reach its goals in the coming days. Russia's defense ministry reports that between 1,000 and 2,000 Russian soldiers have been killed, but independent estimates put the number closer to 10,000. I'd like to welcome now Jack Watling. He's a military analyst at the UK Defence and Security think tank RUSI. Very warm welcome, sir. Thank you for taking out the time to take our questions. A surprising admission by Russia that it has suffered substantial losses. What's your read on that?
So the Russians have taken very substantial losses, and they don't have many more troops to commit, which means that this next operation in the Donbass, they have a limited amount of time before they will need to make some difficult choices about mobilizing reserves and retaining conscripts in the last round. Now, if they do that, they need to prepare the population to admitting that they're at war and explain why that's necessary. And so I think what we're seeing is they're preparing the ground to have options in terms of generating more combat units in around a month's time.
Now, we started our broadcast with the deadly train station attack. Is the rocket strike on a railway station in eastern Ukraine another sign of Russia's campaign of intimidation, or is this a typical pattern of warfare by Russian forces?
It's difficult to tell with this specific strike because attacking rail infrastructure, which is the primary source for logistics for both the Russians and the Ukrainians, is a military target and does make sense. At the same time, the Russians have been striking using these ballistic missiles tactical targets responsively, where they clearly have ISR, so surveillance and reconnaissance of the target. And we know elsewhere that they have deliberately conducted attacks against civilians. And so the question arises whether this is a terror tactic. It could be either way. And I think we need more evidence before we jump to conclusions on that. But it's tragically plausible.
Now, the war seems to have entered another phase with Russia turning its attention or focus on Donbass region. What's your assessment of both sides at this stage?
So there's roughly numerical parity between the Ukrainian defense in the Donbass and the forces attacking them, which is not a great sign for the Russians. But a lot of the Ukrainian forces are fixed along the line of contact by ongoing artillery bombardment and harassment from mobilized civilians in Donetsk and Luhansk. And so the Russian attack will likely come around their flanks from the north and the south and try and encircle those formations. The real question is whether the Russians have enough combat power to close off that encirclement. If they do, then the Ukrainians will find it very difficult to resupply their units, and then they're on, they can only fight so long as they have ammunition and water and food. If the Russians fail to close the circle, then the Russians are very likely to run out of combat power in about 4 weeks.
In conclusion, if Russia does manage to take control of the Donbass region and achieves the land bridge to Crimea, which is apparently one of its objectives, would that be enough of a win for President Putin, or are we likely to still have a very protracted war continue even after that?
It would be enough of a short-term success that he could claim to have achieved something, but I don't think it would be the end of hostilities against Kiev. And from the Ukrainian side, why would they accept a ceasefire that essentially amounts to allowing the Russians to annex more and more of their country every couple of years? So I don't think it will be an end to the fighting. I don't think the Ukrainians would accept an end to the fighting on those terms. And so we are looking at a protracted conflict, which will likely go up and down in intensity, but nonetheless.
And bring in our international affairs commentator, Douglas Herberg. Doug, Russia continues to issue these denials, but new satellite imagery seems to be telling a different story.
Yeah, they can deny and issue these broad blanket denials as much as they want, but more and more the evidence is flying in the face and showing the lie to the propaganda machine. Look, what the latest evidence is, there was an analysis conducted jointly by the New York Times based on images from Maxar Technologies, which has been providing a lot of satellite imagery of what's going on the ground in this conflict, throughout the conflict, really helping investigators, forensic detectives to analyze the truth, get to the facts of what's going on. And they have analyzed photos of the killings of civilians in Bucha. And basically what these photos do in a nutshell, I'll explain what we're seeing, is they are a rebuttal of the claims by the Russian state-controlled media that the killings of these civilians in Bucha took place after the Russian soldiers had left the town. The Russian propaganda, one of their narratives, because they say a lot of things that are contradictory. There's a lot of conspiracy mongering, and it depends who you're listening to at any given moment. But one of their claims is that the bodies in these photos lying on the ground, these apparently dead bodies, were placed there by Ukrainian radicals, as they're called, or Nazis, after the Russian soldiers had left Bucha somewhere around March 30th. Now, that's according to the Russian Defense Ministry's own post on Telegram. Now, what do the photos show? The photos provided by Maxar and analyzed by an investigative team at the New York Times show objects. I'm saying objects because upon closer examination, it's clear that they are bodies on the ground in the exact location that the Ukrainian forces discovered these bodies in the past couple of days over the weekend when they came into the town, in the exact position and the exact number of them. And what the further analysis shows is that many of these bodies, about 11 of them, had been there since more than three weeks, from about March 11th. Why is that significant? More than 3 weeks, because you just heard me say the Russian narrative is that these bodies were placed there by Ukrainian, in quotes, Nazis, trying to provoke, as a provocation to try to discredit, to tar Russia in the eyes of the world and bring more sanctions upon poor, innocent Russia. What this narrative shows is these bodies have been there for weeks during a time in early to mid-March when the Russians controlled Bucha. Not me saying when the Russians controlled Bucha, when the Russians, on their own acknowledgement, controlled Bucha. So you're going to get more and more of this evidence, but this is based on close scrutiny of both video and both photo imagery, close scrutiny of the photos and what they're showing, geolocating the shape of the objects, of the bodies, where they are, when these photos were taken. We're going to see more of this coming forth, but generally it shows the lie to the Russian propaganda. And I will note that right now it is, according to Russian prosecutors, if you publicly blame Russia, if you're Russian in Russia, publicly blame Russia for the atrocities, the killings of civilians in Bucha, you risk facing prosecution.
And despite all this, despite these images, satellite images, etc., the Kremlin continues to push its narrative.
Yeah, and we've heard what that narrative is. The narrative is contradictory because they're trying to come up with some sort of coherent theme. As more and more evidence, the truth will out, as they say. As more and more evidence emerges showing what actually happened and pointing more and more overwhelmingly to the fact that these were atrocities committed at the hands of Russian soldiers. Obviously, yes, investigators will have to get to the very bottom of it, but showing the lie to the Russian narrative, you have an interesting phenomenon at work here. You have Putin's ratings soaring. His ratings now over 80%, around 83%. You actually have this perverse mechanism at work where the Russians, steeped in this virulent state propaganda and this narrative is, as Gulliver, we heard him saying earlier in Ukraine, that narrative that Ukraine needs to be denazified, that not just Zelensky and his government, but that all Ukrainians are potentially Nazi elements that need to be rooted out. That narrative is leading to a sense of both a sense of anti-Ukrainian sentiments in Russia, but also whipping up Russian patriotism and perversely doubling down by Russians, many Russians who only get their news from state-controlled TV media, doubling down in their support of Putin and the sense that he is waging a just war against a threatening Nazi-teeming state. It sounds ludicrous when I stand here and say it that way, but this is a narrative that tens of millions of Russians right now not only accept but embrace. So I end you with the fact that narrative in Russia, Putin more popular than ever, support for the war is higher, and the narrative that seems ludicrous to us that these were not Ukrainian Nazis placing bodies in the street to discredit Russia, that is a narrative that is readily believed and embraced by many, many Russians.
Doug, thank you very much for that. Douglas Ruppert there.
Видишь, как ответить тут на эту вещь?
Let's get more now from DW correspondent Marina Strauss, who joins me from a polling station in central Paris. Good day to you, Marina. There's a lot of talk about the turnout at polling stations like where you're at. How energized do voters seem where you are?
I just went inside this polling station. William, you can see it behind me. It's actually a very nice, very picturesque town hall here in the center of Paris. And officials told me that during the day, a lot of people showed up. Some had to wait for 45 minutes to be able to vote. So here the voter abstention was not very high, but of course this is at the center of Paris and this is not representative when it comes to the whole country. I also talked to a couple of people here. You can see that people are still standing in line because this office will only close at 8 p.m. Tonight, so they still have an hour to cast their votes. And one man, I think, was especially interesting. He said he does not even know yet if he will vote for the far left or Jean-Luc Mélenchon or for the centrist incumbent president Emmanuel Macron, but he certainly does not want to vote for far-right Marine Le Pen. And he said that he's very afraid that she might become the next president of France.
You mentioned that Paris isn't representative of the rest of the country. It's also not representative in terms of support for those candidates you just mentioned. Marine Le Pen has been closing in on Macron in recent polls. What is her appeal to people around the country?
It's the third time Marine Le Pen is running for president in France. And in the recent years, she has tried to come across as more moderate. So she gave interviews to French media only recently, talking about her cats and her personal life to come across as more accessible. And she campaigned. She traveled through France and shook hands and talked to people and said that she's focusing her campaign on their purchasing power, on the rising costs of living. So many people see her now as a viable option, and she's also kind of lucky because there's an even more radical candidate, Eric Zemmour, in the race, and his views are even more radical than hers. So in comparison to him, she comes across as moderate. But we have to be clear here: her policies are radical, are extreme. If she became the next president of France, she would take a harsher stance on immigration. She would also take a harsher stance on immigrants or people with immigrant background living in France. She, for example, said that she would fine women wearing a headscarf in public. And she would also be a very difficult partner for Brussels, for the European Union, because she has very Eurosceptic views. And she would also be a very difficult partner for France's neighbor, Germany.
All right, quickly about Macron, because he is still the favorite to win both this first round and ultimately the presidency in the second round. What are the kind of issues that he's been looking at in his first term that voters seem to be responding to?
Well, some people are still want to vote for Macron because they say some say he was a good leader during the 5 years. For example, he tried to talk to Vladimir Putin, still does so, tries to convince him to end his war in Ukraine. He's a respected leader at the European stage and at the world stage, and that's what many people, or what some people, his voters, also see here in France.
All right, DW correspondent Marina Strauss there in Paris for us. Thanks very much. We're going to have more from Marina and the whole DW team in Paris with live coverage of the early preliminary results of the first round of the French presidential election in just about an hour's time. So stay here for that. It's going to be on DW News at 8 o'clock Central European Time. Now, over in Ukraine and Russia have agreed on humanitarian corridors to evacuate thousands of civilians. Eastern regions of Ukraine are bracing for a new Russian offensive there. More than 100,000 people are believed trapped in the city of Mariupol, which has been under intense bombardment for weeks. Local officials have said as many as 5,000 civilians may have been killed in that city. Ukrainians are fleeing the eastern Donbas region, which has been partially controlled by Russian-backed separatists since 2014. Now, satellite images show a convoy of hundreds of Russian military vehicles heading for the Donbas region, and that's making the evacuation of civilians all the more urgent. correspondent Rebecca Ritters has seen what some of that evacuation looks like. Rebecca, thanks for joining us. What is, first of all, the latest from Luhansk, that region that's part of Donbas in the east?
Well, we are starting to see come to fruition what we've been expecting, the regrouping of Russian troops and the pivot towards to focus on the southeast of Ukraine and the south and the east, including Luhansk and Donetsk, as you just mentioned. Luhansk, it prompted a stronger effort to get people out of there. Luhansk governor has basically told everyone to get out while they still can. Unfortunately, not everyone is heeding that warning. There are still apparently 30% of people staying in Luhansk. I actually met a guy who was reporting down in the region close near there, and I spoke to a gentleman at the train station, and he broke down in tears as he was describing to me that some of his friends from the Luhansk and Donetsk region were actually choosing to stay. They'd already lost everything in the battle in 2014, and they weren't going to leave again. They said if the Russians come in, they're just going to fight them. And he was really obviously very upset. I mean, everyone has seen the pictures from Mariupol, as you just mentioned, and also around Kiev in Bucha, and nobody wants those kind of atrocities happening to their towns and villages, William.
Rebecca, you're also in Dnipro, another city in central eastern Ukraine, and it's become something of a hub for internally displaced Ukrainians. What did you see there?
Well, Dnipro is a transport hub in that region. It services the south and the southeast. We were at the train station doing some reporting yesterday, and we saw thousands of people evacuating. Thousands of people have already come through there, and they're expecting thousands more. The situation, of course, was pretty tense yesterday because it was just shortly after, a day after that bombing at the train station in Kramatorsk, which was just 200 or so kilometers from Dnipro. So authorities were on really high alert there yesterday, really worried that a similar attack might take place there. A lot of the people I spoke to just had come from the regions that we're speaking about, those Luhansk and Donetsk regions, but they just had no idea where they were going to end up. There is a shelter there. People are providing support for the people that come through there, but they're not really able to stay in Dnipro either. The mayor of Dnipro has ordered all women and children to leave the area because they're worried that the fighting is going to also reach that city.
It's difficult to imagine just what people are facing as they're trying to find some semblance of safety in Ukraine. And you saw some of that traveling back to Lviv, where you are now, by train, which a lot of people are using. What kind of experience did you have? What kind of people did you come across on that journey?
Well, it was an incredibly bittersweet experience, really. I mean, you see a relief in some faces, but on the other side, you see the sadness. They're having to leave people behind. So we saw, people we were on the train with waving to their loved ones on the platform who were both relieved that their relatives were getting to safety, but obviously not knowing when or if they're going to see them again. So obviously, there was a lot of sadness on the train. The journey itself was relatively normal. I mean, Ukraine Railways have been doing an amazing job at keeping this country going, the civilian effort, both by getting aid into places that desperately need it, as well as bringing people out of those hotspot areas. There were a couple of amendments, if you will. The blinds needed to be closed for the entire journey at night. As soon as the sun went down, the blinds had to be closed so that you're less visible from the sky. And the train also travels at a much slower pace. It took almost twice as long as the normal journey because if anything does happen, if there's any kind of shelling or anything like that, the train needs to be able to stop to evacuate the passengers.
Incredible details there, Rebecca. Thank you so much. Rebecca Ritters speaking to us from Lviv in Western Ukraine. And let's get some more developments in the war there. Austrian Chancellor Karl Nehammer is to meet the Russian leader Vladimir Putin in Moscow. He'll be the first European leader to do so since the invasion of Ukraine. Nehammer has been in Kyiv, where he offered humanitarian aid and political support. A grave containing at least 2 civilians has been uncovered in Busova village near Kyiv. It's the latest burial site identified since Russian forces withdrew from the area to concentrate on eastern Ukraine. The airport in Dnipro, Ukraine's 4th biggest city, has been badly damaged by Russian missile attacks. That's according to the local governor. Thick columns of smoke could be seen rising around the airport. against the backdrop of the war in Ukraine, Germany is marking the anniversary of the liberation of the Buchenwald concentration camp at the end of World War II. Holocaust survivors and Jewish leaders gathered to remember Nazi crimes that were committed there during the Holocaust. American forces liberated the camp in April 1945. Representatives of Russia and Belarus were asked not to attend the memorial after a Russian attack in Ukraine killed a Holocaust survivor. Our political correspondent Thomas Sparrow filed this report from the camp.
The atmosphere is always heavy, it's always difficult in former Nazi concentration camps like this one, like Buchenwald. 280,000 people from all over Europe were sent here by the Nazis. 56,000 people were killed. And the atmosphere today is even more difficult because events here in Buchenwald have been overshadowed by the war in Ukraine. Camp survivors have condemned the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and in fact, Russian government officials were uninvited to ceremonies here in Buchenwald. And this also has to do with the death of Boris Romanchenko, 96-year-old. He survived 4 concentration camps, including Buchenwald, but was killed in the Ukrainian city of Kharkiv in March. Therefore, it is particularly important that participants here today in Buchenwald renewed a pledge for a world in peace and freedom.
Watching DW News, here's a reminder of our main stories. France is voting in the first round of its presidential election. Polls put President Emmanuel Macron ahead, but show the far-right challenger Marine Le Pen closing the gap. And Ukraine and Russia have agreed on humanitarian corridors to evacuate thousands of civilians. Eastern regions of Ukraine are braced for an expected new Russian offensive. Watch DW News. Coming up next, we have world stories, reports from the besieged Ukrainian city of Mariupol. You can always get the latest on our website, dw.com, and of course, Instagram and Twitter at DW News. As said, we're going to have those poll results for you, initial poll results from the French election at 8 o'clock Central European time. Join us for that. See you soon.
So you want to know what makes the Germans tick? News just in. The Germans love beer and banning things.
Step away from the fun.
What? I'm not even allowed to wash my own car. No. And everyone with Lederhosen every single day. Just kidding. Are you ready to meet the Germans? Then join me, Rachel Stewart, on DW.
Not just another day. So much is happening all at once. We take time to understand. This is The Day, an in-depth look at
The change in command. A new general taking over Russia's war in Ukraine. Russian President Vladimir Putin has appointed General Alexander Vornikov as the new commander after Russian troops stalled in Kiev, failing to take that capital city, of course. Russia is now believed to be preparing for an assault in the eastern part of the country.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is praising UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson for the additional military equipment that Britain is sending to Ukraine. Johnson made a surprise visit yesterday when he visited Kyiv and met with President Zelensky. The Ukrainian leader urged countries to follow the example of the United Kingdom to provide more weapons and support for Ukraine.
But Ukraine does not have time to wait. Freedom does not have time to wait. When tyranny launches aggression against everything that keeps peace in Europe, action must be taken immediately.
Now, the head of the European Union Commission says Ukrainians are showing incredible bravery against Russia. But the fight isn't Ukraine's alone. She also says the carnage she saw in the town of Bucha left her speechless.
There are no words for the horror I've seen in Bucha. The ugly face of Putin's army terrorizing people. They are fighting our war. It's our fight that they are in, because it's not only Ukraine fighting for its sovereignty and integrity, but they're also fighting for the question whether humanity will prevail or whether heinous devastation will be the result.
In Odessa, in the southern part of Ukraine, officials have imposed a weekend curfew in response to the deadly attack on a train station in the eastern part of the country. Residents have been told to stay home until 6 a.m. local time tomorrow because of the constant threat of Russian missile attacks. And we are getting reports of new missile strikes in eastern Ukraine ahead of what could be a deadly offensive by Russia.
President Vladimir Putin appointed a new general, as we said, to take over Russia's war on Ukraine. CNN correspondent Phil Black joins us live from Lviv. So, Phil, this general has a history. Talk to us about what we know regarding him.
Yeah, Christy Boris, good morning. We know that Russia is planning something big in the east, and we now know who is going to be responsible for it, indeed responsible for all of Russia's operations in the east, across the country, because according to Western officials, Russia has, for the first time, appointed an overall commander to cover the entire theatre of operations. His name is General Alexander Dvornikov, and his history will add to concerns about the likely brutality of Russia's coming operations. He was the commander of Russia's intervention in the Syrian civil war. That was a campaign notorious for the terror, death, and suffering inflicted on the civilian population.
And Phil, these new satellite images from eastern Ukraine, they show an 8-mile convoy of Russian troops. This is just east of Kharkiv. What do you make of this new intelligence of these images?
You're right, Boris. So just east of Kharkiv, very close to the Russian border, heading south. It is made up, by the looks of it, of armored vehicles, artillery, other support vehicles as well. Russia's advance south through that eastern region, south beyond Kharkiv, through Izium, is considered one of the key lines of advance, or its attempted lines of advance, as it seeks to expand its control of that eastern region. And it's expected that that is where Russia is going to try to push through and break Ukrainian lines. It is likely to be matched with an advance from the south of the country, moving north. And so the concern is that Ukrainian forces in the middle could be overwhelmed, could be squeezed, could perhaps be cut off. But that area, that region with those two lines of advance are expected to be the key battlefronts once Russia launches these new expected operations.
Phil Black, we so appreciate all the new information. Thank you. Now, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson is bringing encouragement and a promise of more military assistance to Ukraine.
Johnson made a surprise trip to the capital, Kyiv, where he met with President Zelensky. CNN correspondent Nina Elbager has more on what the visit means and what it means specifically to Ukraine.
This evening in Kyiv, the city is somber and almost silent as it dims its lights for curtains. But during the day, it was very different scenes as British Prime Minister Boris Johnson became just the latest world leader to make a pilgrimage to the Ukrainian capital. He brought with him much of what was expected, a raising of Britain's guarantee of Ukraine's debt ceiling at the IMF to almost $1.5 billion in total, much of the same defensive military aid, probably not exactly what the Ukrainians were hoping for or thought they needed, but he brought, as other world leaders had also done, something that Ukrainians tell us is almost more important. He brought a sense of respite, because they know that when Prime Minister Boris Johnson or others like him come here, then for that short space of time, they are safe. For that short space of time, they feel a little less isolated by this conflict from the rest of the world. Prime Minister Johnson has gone, and with it has gone the safety that he brought. But for many Ukrainians, they hope that visits will continue, as well as the defensive aid, as the Russian offensive in the east of the country continues to build up steam. Eventually, they're hoping more than just visits and respite will come with these global leaders. Nehmet Barre, CNN, Kyiv, Ukraine.
Thank you so much. The United Nations Refugee Agency says nearly 4.5 million Ukrainians have left their country since the start of Russia's invasion. But here's the thing, there are so many more, as many as 7 million who are still there, displaced within Ukraine. Antonio Vitorino Director General of the UN International Organization for Migration, is with us now. General, thank you so much. Director, we appreciate it so much. I want to ask you, when we talk about this alarming number, 7.1 million people who are in Ukraine, still, we don't know if they're trying to escape, we don't know if they're choosing to stay there, but what is your greatest concern for those people?
Those people who are internally displaced, which means that they are no longer in their homes, are displaced because of the war. And out of the 7.1, 30% are seriously considering leaving the countries. And out of the 7.1, 12% are in the east of the country, where the Russian offensive is now being deployed. So we are very concerned, not just with the safety of those people, but also to make sure that we assess their needs. Cash, health, medicine, food.
А как ты мне прикажешь? Да, людям, так сказать, человеческому. Мне вообще денег не дают. Я вообще не... То есть, ну, как? Ну, это у них... Да. Россия еще... Нет, я человек такой. Ну, да. Все парадигмы все равно тоже, да, то есть созидание. В своей стране вы созидание. Роду человеческому как будешь служить? Надо бежать или бежать это не делать. А ты как хотел? Какая еще свобода? Хорошо, это свобода, а за чей счет она это? То есть это уже не свобода, это рабство, значит. Просто потребление. То есть ты раб тех, кто производит, и они не все согласятся бесплатно. То есть, короче, бесплатно. Свобода это не есть свобода. А свобода это когда ты уебываешься, когда свобода. То есть, блядь, чера, ну так надо! Это свобода, да? То есть политика, а когда ты уебываешься по ТВ, да, и красиво что ты говоришь. Хорошо, если это... это еще тоже деньги будут, хорошо. Если у тебя такая цель, дальше что? Дальше ты что? Ну, ты 10-й год, дальше что? Я просто имею в виду, что надо как-то не предавать родину, страну свою не предавать. Потому что я понимаю, это и есть часть человечества. То есть, как бы, и даже простая логика. Тебе проще всего начать со своей страны, так скажем, да? И отсюда и надо начать. А то тебя съест, как бы. И что если ты ничего не понимаешь, служить людям. чем проблема? Ладно, не люди, иди дворником. То, что взял, и я тоже так. Наоборот, значит. Я просто современный. Ну, играй, значит, ура! Видишь, летний работа вообще такой. Ну, пока, ну, как бы пока не делать. Ну, то есть слишком много пробелов. Слишком много, чем я занимался, чем я учился. Куча образований, а опыта трудовой деятельности не меня тоже пугает это слово «старший работник», потому что это значит, что вся жизнь как бы ничего. Да. То есть, как бы, это означает, старшая работа означает, что ты вообще не мужчина. Ну, как объяснить, что ты не да просто. Тоже давно ну, я не знаю, какое это мужчина, мужество какого-нибудь, ян свободного человека, что ты труп уже давно. Да. То есть, много чего. Мейкера, бизнесмен. Выходит, и он сам себе тоже сидит, с батареей разговаривает, конечно, там тоже, он тоже такой, он бизнесмейкер, который не знает. То есть, ну, вот ты это, я имею в виду, что... Ну ладно, ну, создавать бизнес, то есть, и зарабатывать. Ну, не знаю, я сейчас наверное, в Норвегах он, наверное, помогает людям ну, или, можно сказать, тренер подпинывает их, чтобы они сами создавали. Просто посылает их подальше. Не касается, просто так. Ну, его бизнес-мейкинг получается. Пошел нахуй.
Собрать всех здесь. У нас времени осталось 3 минуты для 40 замечаний.
Несколько минут до премьеры сегодня в детском музыкальном театре юного актера, волшебник изумрудного города. Это новая веха в истории театра.